Welcome back, class. This is a continuation of a basic introduction to ethics at St. Vincent College. We are today covering some of the basic concepts from Book 5 of Aristotle's Ethics. Book 5 of Aristotle's Ethics is on the virtue of justice. The virtue of justice. It is a rather difficult chapter because you'll notice if you read the book that there's a number of graphs that Aristotle uses trying to depict different schemas of how perhaps wealth should be distributed, or exactly what is proportionately fair or arithmetically fair. We're not going to get into some of those particulars. We're going to just try to stay to some more general concepts. Those concepts would be more appropriate for a graduate school class. But you're certainly welcome to look at those. And there's a great deal of information on the internet about the meaning of some of those charts that Aristotle has. But we will not be covering those specifically. But at least my hope, as I've repeated probably every single class, my intention here is to give you a kind of map by which you can at least begin to categorize what you are reading as you go. So that after my lecture, if you were to return again to the text, you could return with greater facility and understand at least a little bit more of what Aristotle is talking about. So, without further ado, justice, a general definition of justice, and I don't think I'm exactly quoting Aristotle, but I really may be. One of the more general definitions of justice would be giving to each according to what is his or her due. There's a few different ways that could be said. Giving to each what each deserves is the virtue of justice. And justice is a virtue. Aristotle isn't simply talking about something purely political here or just purely social, although he is talking about that because he does have discussions of political justice towards the end of the book. But justice is also a personal virtue as well as a virtue of society as a whole. Aristotle, of course, was a student of Plato, his master teacher, for about 20 years, I believe. And if you'll remember, if you've ever studied this before, Plato wrote one of the greatest also works of philosophy ever written called The Republic. The Republic. The entire book is more or less on the virtue of justice. Okay, that really is the subject of the entire book. So, just to let you know, here Aristotle is just writing a few notes on what he considers just, and there are a number of comparisons, as a matter of fact, a number of footnotes where you can tell that Aristotle is referring to some of the arguments of his master teacher Plato in this book. But we're not gonna go quite into that. But the point I wanted to make there is one of Plato's main points in the Republic is that the city is man, or the human person, written large. The city is man writ large. In other words, we're going to get in the greater society the form of justice that is most present in the souls of its members. So if you have tons of, I mean, I'm saying this in a rather colloquial way, if you have tons of unjust people in your city, you're going to have an unjust form of government. Uh, and it gets far more complex than that. But I think that it's a point worth making, especially if you want to study some of these concepts a little bit more deeply. But when we go back to that definition of justice as giving to each what it deserves, and I'll use it because there could be a number of possibilities here, because we're talking about a very broad virtue here. And one of the reasons why this book is so complex is that Aristotle is quite aware that there are a number of different senses in which justice can be used. Like, well, are we talking about justice just according to what's legal, or justice just according to how we treat one another, or maybe justice in comparison with other virtues? And so it's complex because when you're talking about something as broad as justice, it really depends on what context or what sense we're using it. So I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a heads up. One of the reasons why this is a complex conversation, complex lecture, because these are lecture notes, is Aristotle is well aware, completely well aware, much more well aware than we are, that there are many, many different senses of the word justice, okay? So if we look at this practically speaking, we realize that in our society, in our relationships with other persons, there are certain obligations. We're really talking about duties here, responsibilities, duties. I owe certain things, even in a certain sense, to the care of myself. Although, and Aristotle at the very end has an interesting discussion about whether you can truly be just or unjust to yourself. We're not going to touch that right now because that it's an interesting question, but we're not going to touch it right now. I want to. It's like, oh, I want to talk about it, but I'm not going to do it. So certain duties to myself, certainly certain duties to my family, okay? Duties or obligations to my friends. And we're not simply talking about things, when I say duty, a lot of times people understand things we have to do. That's not exactly what I'm talking about here. It could mean that, but it also could mean something like, well, look, if I know that my best friend's father dies, well, don't I owe him some kind of sympathy? Some form of time, some gift of myself? Because I mean, my best friend is down on his luck, and so I owe him. Oh, it is his due to receive from his friend something, some kind of consolation that really has little to do with the law, so to speak, okay? Do you understand? So we could be talking about obligations that are legal, but we also could be talking about obligations that are really much more than legal. Here at a college like St. Vincent's, the students here, you owe certain things to the college by virtue of justice. You owe payment. You owe certainly a certain level of study. Let's hope that's happening, right? In order to make certain grades. While COVID is on, for example, and we have some of these different regulations regarding safety, there are some obligations there. Some of them are legal, and some of them we just do really out of respect. I'm certainly going to be much more diligent about things like that if I know that I'm around a population that's very compromised. If I'm around an elderly population or some people that I know perhaps have an autoimmune disease, I'm going to be super, super particular. And some of those obligations are legal now, and some of those obligations in justice are really just what's owed simply because we're human beings, and that there are certain laws, certain virtues that exist by nature. Okay. Now this is according to Aristotle. Now, hopefully by now, you know that not all philosophers would agree that some virtues, some obligations exist by nature. But Aristotle certainly is not one of those individuals. And we're going to get to a little bit more of that discussion in just a moment. So that is what justice is broadly construed. Giving to others, let's say to myself, just for the sake of argument right now, that's more complicated, but to myself, to others, to another organization, to even God, the gods. Okay. In other words, even Aristotle would accept that that's true. Did you know that there was a special virtue by which we give to the gods, or God, because we're talking about a pagan, right? He's going to have a whole group of gods. So that's the way he would phrase it. The virtue of giving to God what is his due is called piety. Surprise, surprise. Okay. So piety is a certain form of justice, but it's a form of justice that deals specifically with divine things, right? Does that make some sense? Hopefully. So we realize that justice, from my friendships to one another, to legal obligations, to what I even owe a supreme being, there's a pretty wide berth between all of those, right? So when we talk about justice, we're talking about it's very real, and there is a common definition. Giving to each, whatever we're talking about, a friend, an organization, a self, another person, God, giving to each what is its due, okay? So I know I'm repeating that numerous times, but why not? Repetition is the mother of learning. So if I want at this point to just mention something, because I think that it's fair to mention other things that are related to this discussion, especially in a general class, in a class that is an introduction and not necessarily white hot specific as it would be in the grad school class. It's morning. I need my coffee, y'all. Of course, I drink it in the afternoon too, so that's no excuse. Aristotle considers justice the master virtue, the absolute master virtue. In other words, it really seems like Aristotle would say that if you had a virtue, then it should be justice. Now, we hear him say this in the Oswald translation, as we've been using. This is in Book 5, Chapter 1. It reads as follows. Thus, this kind of justice is complete virtue or excellence, not in an unqualified sense, but in relation to our fellow men. And for that reason, justice is regarded as the highest of all virtues, more admirable than morning star or evening star. And as the proverb has it, in justice, every virtue is summed up. It is complete virtue and excellence in the fullest sense, because it is the practice of complete virtue. It is complete because he who possesses it can make use of his virtue not only by himself, but also in his relations with everyone. Okay, so there's a lot going on there that we are going to unpack it a little bit, but not completely. If we think about it this way, Aristotle, in a certain sense, is trying to explain that, you know what, if we were just, truly just, which is not just a personal moral virtue, it's also a virtue specifically in relation to everyone else. Okay? In other words, I can be brave. Say I'm brave, courageous. Aristotle goes through pains to talk about what courage is, right? That can just be something I have in here, just in me, It's personal, it's individual. Doesn't matter if you're courageous. I have courage. But if I'm just, it implies that in a relationship with something or someone else, I am truly just. Another, justice implies relationships. It implies them. Okay, that's it. That's one of the main things that Aristotle's trying to say with that particular statement. Does that make some sense? Those of you that are present, that there's a relationship implied there. There's some background here, and I did write these on the board. These are called the four cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. Prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. The tradition really since Plato or so, has the cardinal virtue. Cardinal, I believe, means a kind of hinge upon which everything else turns. So that if you have certain virtues, at least in the ancient tradition, it changes somewhat with the Christian tradition, although the Christian tradition does absorb these and still calls them the cardinal virtues. It just adds love as really the absolute summit of all virtue. The Christian dispensation would really consider love as superior, and every other virtue as kind of a subcategory or species, or just different kinds of love. Every single virtue is just a different kind of love that really comes from Augustine. It's kind of a statement from Augustine. So if we just take a look at these real quick, I've already talked about justice and repeated myself numerous times about a general definition. Prudence, the philosopher, of course, Thomas Aquinas, calls these one of the master virtues. Because, of course, and we're going to see this particularly with the next chapter, which talks more about intellectual virtue. Well, every moral virtue, think about this. This is key for next chapter, but let's preempt ourselves. Every moral action involves a choice, right? We learned that, I think, mostly in book 3, didn't we? I think that's where it was 2, I think it was 3. But a choice implies some rational activity. If a choice does not have rational activity, then it is involuntary, remember? And you really can't completely be blamed for a decision. Well, we'll go, you understand that point, hopefully, okay? So, but if you truly make a choice, then you had to have thought. There has to be rationality there. So if you don't have prudence deciding which direction to go in, well, the whole structure of discussing what is just or what is unjust just falls apart. Prudence is, I think it's Thomas Aquinas' image, kind of says that prudence is like the the pilot of the ship. Prudence decides where you're going, because prudence is that virtue that, practically speaking, we try to apply different virtues and different actions to each individual situation. I mean, you know, with parents, okay, we have young Mary is here, right? You know, say Mary commits the same infraction on some particular thing this week, and she commits the same one next week. But what if next week her emotional circumstances are supremely different? So in prudence, you decide to treat Mary differently next week because she is emotionally compromised. Prudence does that. It's like she committed the same infraction, but you treat it differently. What did you do, Mary? Tell us. What did you do? No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So you understand what prudence is, generally speaking. Okay. Temperance. Temperance is kind of the gateway, as I've talked to you about before, to the higher virtues. If you cannot get your animal nature under control, namely your desires, your emotions, okay, your sense pleasures, okay, which is the virtue of temperance, it more like the guiding and tempering, well, temperance, that's where the word comes from, your sense pleasures and your desires. If you can't control those, again, doesn't everything fall apart? It really does. I mean, you're not going to get on to talking about what justice is. That's way up here. Okay. You can't get your animal nature under control. So let's not talk about what's up here, because you can't get there. This is why these are called the cardinal virtues. Everything is based on them, okay? Fortitude, that virtue by which we face our fears and go through them or overcome obstacles. That's essentially the function of fortitude. And I'm giving general definitions, not really super specific ones, but they're close. That's the virtue that helps us have courage, right? And to face our fears and to push through obstacles. Now, I hate to break this to y'all, in case you didn't know it already, but you're going to have to face your fears and push through obstacles for the rest of your life, right? So if you don't have a little discipline, if you don't have a little get up and go and a little grit, whatever you want to call it, you're not going to do very well, okay? I hate to break it to you, okay? And there might be a number of reasons for that. I mean, that's often why certain people go to counseling. That's often why we go through different training programs or learning different habits. We're trying to increase our level of discipline, our fortitude, so that we can meet with those obstacles that we know that we're going to face in this life, okay? So I think that this was a good time to stop and at least briefly introduce the 4 cardinal virtues, which these are, because Aristotle is at pains to tell us one of the major ones, certainly the major one for him, at least in this context, is justice, okay? So does that make some sense? Okay. I want to move on to talking about a discussion that Aristotle has concerning complete and partial justice. Complete justice, I've really been characterizing this already. This broad version of what I've been introducing is what Aristotle would call complete justice. He also explains to us Aristotle is very concerned with what is legal, what is lawful. He really identifies what is just with what is truly lawful. And at first, that even confused me a little bit, because I know for a fact that Aristotle would agree that there are some laws that regimes could make, regimes meaning forms of government, for those of you that are not aware of that word, a regime, that certain regimes can make laws that he would consider unjust. I know that he would say that. However, in this particular chapter, he identifies the lawful with the just fairly closely. Aristotle is mostly talking about an aristocratic form of government. In other words, a form of government that is controlled or organized by the individuals that he would consider as the best and virtuous men. That's what an aristocracy is. At this time, Athens is a democracy in a limited sense, in the sense that those with a stake in Athenian society, I think it was just property owners or hoplites or warriors who were males, only males, only they had a vote. And we have to realize at all times that that is essentially the population that Aristotle is writing for, because those are the ones who are making the laws. So that's something, that's a context that I think may help us understand where Aristotle is coming from. But let's just talk about partial justice. Complete justice we've been implying all along, and I'll talk about as well in just a bit when we get to equity. But he mentions two particular kinds of justice: distributive and I guess rectificatory. And I'm not even 100% certain I'm saying that right. Rectification. Let's call it rectifying justice. Recta in Latin means to right, to make right, okay? And that'll give you a hint about what it actually means. These two forms of justice have different senses, and I'm sure that Aristotle defines them more specifically in the books. I'm gonna give you some examples and talk about what they mean so that you have a little bit better of a picture. First, distributive justice. Distributive justice, perhaps the best example, an example that Aristotle was quite well aware of, that we would have in our society, because Aristotle is very, very concerned about politics. He was even one of the tutors for Alexander the Great, so he was involved in court politics and certainly the politics of his time. Is the welfare system. Distribution. What is really fair to distribute to different sections of society? Remember the broadest sense of justice, to give to each one what is its due, right? Remember that? So distributive justice is a certain kind of justice that usually deals with, it could deal with distribution even among family, distribution in a city, distribution in a country. The population really doesn't matter, but the concept would be the same, right? In a family, we might say, okay, look, if you do your chores, you get more allowance. But there are other families that might say, no, every child receives the same no matter what, because they're all equal. Well, that's kind of a different form of distribution, isn't it? It operates by a different rule. Now, Aristotle is quite well aware that there could be different bases for how we distribute things, okay? Goods. And when Aristotle means goods, he just doesn't mean stuff or money. You know, that could mean food. It could mean privileges of society. You know, who can vote, who can go where, except, you know, who can serve in the military, blah, blah. You know, that's a kind of good in Aristotle's mind. It could mean money. It could mean a level of honor, you know, notoriety. So, you know, there's a number of things, in other words, that can be distributed. There's a couple of things we should remember here. A number of different kinds of goods that can be distributed, and several different bases by which we decide to distribute what is going to be distributed. And he gives a few examples. He'll say, and he doesn't really completely settle the argument here, which again is sometimes frustrating for us, because sometimes we want to just throw our hands up and go, tell us the right answer, Aristotle. See, Chelsea loves that, right? He certainly, in many other places, he does indicate what his opinion is, which I'll let you know. So he says that an oligarch, which is a certain kind of oligarchy, is the rule of a few, a small group, really on the basis of wealth or power. It's generally considered a fairly an unfair form of government for Aristotle. I'm not going to get into those particulars. There's a whole book that Aristotle writes on this called The Politics. If you want to take a look at it, you do that. Okay, so you realize I'm just going right over the surface. So an oligarch would say that goods should be distributed on the basis of wealth and noble birth. If you were, you know, if you were high-born, if you were from a certain family, or if you have the money, well, that should give you more rights to more things. I'm kind of saying, and there have certainly been numerous regimes like that throughout history, even in our own country, right? So a Democrat would say, well, no, everything should be more freely distributed. It just is based on the fact that you're free, that goods should be distributed. An aristocrat, which Aristotle considers the rule of the best, the smartest and the noblest, those that are virtuous. Aristotle is definitely an aristocrat. Always remember that. He thinks that society should basically be ruled by a smaller group of people who know better. Now, because our countries, because there are people here from the United States and Canada, are really more democratic, that bothers some of us. But in politics classes, you'll get a lot more of a heated discussion about that. Would we really be worse off if we could find a smaller group of people who are noble and intelligent to make our decisions than just letting everybody decide? I'm not going to answer that for you, but there's some rational arguments for aristocracy. That's all I'm saying. That sometimes we have prejudices against this because it's not ours. We have generally a democratic mindset. But is that the best one? Maybe not. Okay. So an aristocrat would say that goods should be distributed on the basis of virtue. So that's a different kind of distribution, right? That would be rather like, say you have 6 children, and you have kind of a standard about, okay, well, if you don't mouth off, and if you do your chores, and you're doing this and that, well, then you get more privileges. You can stay out later, or you can get more allowance, or you can have more friends over. Okay, well, that's a system, that's an aristocratic system. It's based on virtue. And is that such a bad thing? Other families will know all the children, it's more just to treat them absolutely equal, because that will more ensure their psychological health, or however you might want to put that. That would be a more democratic system, wouldn't it? I mean, an oligarchic system? Ugh. Remember, oligarchic is just by nature unfair. Say you're from a split family, and you have like a stepfather, and you see that one set of kids is treated differently than another set, just because of how they were born. That would be oligarchic, wouldn't it? I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. I'm just trying to give you some, and I'm only using some analogies, but hopefully they are at least fair enough that you can see that there are different kinds of goods that can be distributed: security, wealth, privilege, and there are different bases on which they should be distributed. And there's fairly little doubt that Aristotle comes on the side of the virtuous, comes on the side of the aristocratic view of things. Rectification, rectificatory justice, making things right. What rectification usually does is to remedy unequal distributions of gain or loss between people. Okay, our law courts are full of rectification cases. I'm making a stab at it, but I studied politics for quite a number of years. When we're suing people, a lot of times this is what's going on. In other words, how can you really, when you have two things that are fundamentally different, like someone slanders another person, on the internet or in public, and it harms your reputation and your business, possibly does you some psychological harm. How do you balance that against some monetary amount that might be owed to you because these other goods have been damaged? How do you, because they're two different things, slander, like, versus a money owed or my business being hurt. And you're doing this balancing act. One person has lost, one person has gained, and a judge tries to balance that. That's rectification. Okay, that's rectification. Does that make some sense? Mary, you following that so far? Good? Okay. Can these two be mixed? Unfortunately, yes. Okay, it can get really complicated. In other words, say we're dealing with, there's a lot of discussion in our time about certain classes of people that have been underprivileged, or who have received less rights, less privileges than another. And so there's a double discussion going on there, that we're trying to figure out how to set some things right because apparently there was something wrong. Okay, and I'm talking in very broad generalities here. And there's also discussion about well, how do we distribute goods because something has been wrong? There has been an imbalance. So politically speaking, there is something that can happen in the middle where these two are kind of joined. So just in case, because this happened in class, there are certain students that started saying, well, what about this? And what about this? Is it rectification or is it distribution? And as I thought about it, because they were good questions, as I thought about it, I was saying, you know what? There's aspects of both in the situations that you are bringing up. And I just brought up one, like underprivileged classes, for example. So just so as you know, at least theoretically, the difference between distributive and rectification is what's important, okay? Could you pause for just a moment there? All right, I want to go into the discussion of what is politically just. What is politically just? As I mentioned before, because we did do a lecture on natural law, and a fairly famous statement that St. Thomas Aquinas has concerning natural law, particularly the distinction between human law and natural law, is a law that is unjust is no law at all. A law that is unjust is no law at all. And that's, of course, what he means is that, and we know this because we argue about it every day. You can just open up your paper or look at just about any article on politics on the internet, and you're going to find some discussion about why a human law that we have created is not just. Now, that's very interesting. Why, by what standard are all of us saying, or certain groups, maybe I shouldn't say all of us, saying that certain laws are unjust? That has been an argument since the beginning of philosophy. And we see it in this particular chapter on political justice. That's why I bring it up, because these concepts that we're talking about, that's what I try to stick to. I'm not sure if you realize that. I try to stick to the concepts that are still quite relevant today. There is another way to teach this class. I could go into particulars about what Aristotle is talking about, but this is an introductory class. So it seems to me to mention those concepts that an intelligent person, when he or she is confronted by ethical decisions, has concepts to intelligently speak about this, rather than, well, this is my opinion because it's just my opinion. Well, then you don't have much going on up here unless you can discuss with some rationality the concepts involved. I'm not making fun of anybody in particular. I'm just encouraging people to learn the concepts by which we discuss these things. That's why I concentrate on certain things more than others. Now, so the politically just, Aristotle, and this is of course book 5, chapter 6, for those of you that are following. He says some interesting things in this chapter. For the just exists only among, I'll say individuals, to be more inclusive, he has men there, only among people whose mutual relationship is regulated by law and law exists where injustice may occur. Now, he also mentions, for the politically just depends upon law and applies to people who have a natural capacity for law. That is, people who have the requisite equality in ruling and being ruled. Now, there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot of controversy involved in what I just said. He's saying that the discussion of what is politically just is really only relevant to those people with a certain level of, I guess, virtue and education. That what is politically just, in other words, among criminals and among those who are beast-like, Aristotle would say, discussing what's politically just is irrelevant because they wouldn't listen. Why don't you go to a massive state prison in the United States and then start discussing with mass murderers and rapists how they should treat each other fairly and unfairly? It's not the same discussion as it is among another population. It's just not. Because prisons are, and this is not in every case, but generally speaking, it is. I've ministered in prisons before. For the most part, prisons are full of people that should be there. And for whatever reason, and there's a different, in other discussing what's politically just there, Aristotle says is just simply irrelevant. They're not going to listen. Try to discuss what's politically just in a kindergarten class. Let's talk about that. It's just as good of a comparison. That makes no sense whatsoever, does it? Because you're not dealing with a population that can sort of equally discuss ruling and being ruled. You really can't. You just sort of have, that's why we have entire courses on how to teach kids of that age. There's a certain very delicate way that they need to be taught and handled. But talking about what's politically just with them, not going to work. Okay. Now I'm being rather colloquial about this discussion, but I'm again trying to paint things in broad strokes. Okay. There are two kinds of, I guess, political justice that Aristotle talks about, which is very, very important for us to understand. Some laws which exist by nature and other laws which exist by convention. I just referred to this discussion that Aristotle well recognizes that there is and he says this very clearly in the book, that some philosophers and lawmakers seem to hold the point that every law exists by convention. What does that mean? Let's refer to the natural law, because we had a discussion on that. That would mean if you hold the position that every law exists merely by convention, then you think that every law is merely a human law, and there is no standard by which to truly judge the justice of that human law or that convention. Human law could almost be a synonym for convention. Almost. If we understand by human law, a law just merely made up by humans with no real standard. Uh, and we've talked about this from the beginning. This would be the difference between, remember, objectivity. Remember, we've talked about objectivity and subjectivity. Do you recall that? It's not exactly the same thing, but it is close. That if you're an objective thinker, you believe that you'll probably believe in a mix, that some laws exist by nature, some virtues exist by nature, and some we do the best we can. We make up kind of an arbitrary rule, which could be changed. Okay, you know, if I simply decide, say I have a certain set of concepts, and they match up with those four cardinal virtues. I'm just kind of throwing out a hypothetical situation that everything I write on the board has to do with prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And so in order to teach you better, every time I talk about one of those concepts, I write something on the board in a different color. You know, like red for prudence and green for justice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of a tool I use that hopefully isn't confusing, but it might be, right? That is something that is a law or a rule that exists entirely by convention. I mean, there's no moral goodness or badness to me picking different colors to write on the board, is there? It doesn't matter, okay? But if I say I decide to give the final exam on different dates to different students, because, well, just maybe I think that some of them perform better or worse. And so I'm just going to give the final exam on different dates. Uh-oh. Okay. Nature or convention? And I guarantee you could, if I were to do that in any school on the face of the planet, do you think I would get complaints from students? I bet you I would. Okay. In almost any language, virtually any place. Okay. Unless you were a complete tyrannical rule and you were just scared to death to make any kind of complaint whatsoever. Okay. But there is a fairness. There's justice involved. There seems to be something by nature that I'm violating. That is not merely a convention. We're talking about relationships of justice between those who teach and those who are learning. And I think that we could probably all agree with that. Now, is discovering what is just by nature and by convention easy? Absolutely not. We have been arguing about it since philosophy really began, okay? So this is a massive, massive argument. Now, one thing I would like to bring up at this point is Thomas Hobbes. We've discussed Thomas Hobbes and contract theory. You remember that? And which seems to be getting a little bit more traction nowadays. I've seen several more articles on Thomas Hobbes, and at first it surprised me, but we've discussed why that might be the case. That the politically just for Thomas Hobbes would only exist after we make a contract, right? After we establish laws. And then we could talk about what's fair and unfair because, well, society has come together and made laws. But I believe Thomas Hobbes would essentially say that the whole social contract really exists by convention. It's something we make up. The only thing objective about it is it certainly does seem that all humans, we do want a certain level of security. We want to keep our lives in order, and we want to keep ourselves alive, period. And we want to keep our goods and our family. So there's something that seems to exist by nature in Hobbes, something. But generally speaking, the whole social contract is more by convention in that mindset. Aristotle is certainly saying, no, there's far more that exists by nature than Thomas Hobbes says. Now, of course, he wouldn't know Thomas Hobbes because he doesn't come around for about 2,000 more years. But philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and lawmakers like Thomas Hobbes did exist in Aristotle's time. And Aristotle does not like them, and he thinks they are wrong. Okay? It's true. He disagrees with them. Far more exists by nature. And what Aristotle would further say is that society or aristocracy should rule because a certain group of individuals who have the intellect and the moral rectitude to figure out what exists by nature, that group should be in charge of figuring out convention. And if the lawmaker does this well, he is a good lawmaker. And if he does it badly, he is a bad one. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, we're certainly dealing with terribly complex issues, but it's in an intro class. But I want to end with one last mention, and it is implied in this discussion, but something a little extra that I think that I should mention, just like the 4 cardinal virtues. In our society, Canadian and United States, as well as in other particularly first world countries, when rights and duties are mentioned, which one of these terms do you think that we talk about a lot more? Rights or duties? What do you hear more about?
Rights.
Rights. Easily. What I want my rights, right? Right. No pun intended. Okay. I want my rights, right? My rights. We talk about this quite a lot. There's a problem with that. And certainly we do need to talk about rights because our rights are incredibly important, particularly natural rights. Natural rights, which is a whole nother philosophical discussion. A certain group of philosophers would agree that we do have certain natural rights, and another group would really not. The problem with discussing rights all the time and demanding rights, there's a question of justice, a real question of justice here. That's why I think it's relevant in this discussion. So we're talking all about justice. Every right implies a duty. Every right, or we even might say responsibility, is another way that duty is often referred to. A very key one, for example, something that's being discussed particularly in the United States, because national health care, for example, already exists in Canada. If I have the quote unquote right to national health care, then that implies that everyone else has a duty to make sure you have it. Uh-oh. There could be a problem with that, couldn't there? what if national health care includes, which it does, incredibly, and I'm not going to come down on one side or another on this because it's not my point. It includes things like abortion. It includes things like gender reassignment. It includes things like, well, I mean, special or equal health care for those who have almost intentionally wrecked their health with overeating and with drugs, as opposed to someone who has just an acute medical problem through no fault of their own. Are they really equal? Some people say yes, some people say no. I'm not going to come down on one side or another. But those are incredibly controversial issues, are they not? We could certainly agree on that. There's really no disagreement with that. But if certain people are demanding, like say a right to abortion, well, a whole massive section of society thinks that abortion, for example, is wrong. But they have then the duty to pay for it when they find it morally reprehensible. There's a balancing act going on here that's incredibly difficult, isn't there? So what I'm trying to, and for some of you, because there's a lot of younger people, you may have intuited this. In other words, you may have kind of understood that this was a dilemma or these were controversies, but you may never have been able to find the concepts to explain why. What I'm trying to do is give you some concepts to explain why there's a justice issue involved. Okay, the reason why is because every time a right is demanded means that a whole nother section of society, if not the whole society, sometimes it's certain sections, has the duty to make sure that you have that right. And then it's like, uh-oh, then we get problems. Do you see that? Okay, and it's immensely complicated sometimes whenever we leave class and you are terribly more intellectually frustrated than what it began. That's actually a good sign because it's making you think. So generally speaking, those are some aspects of justice of book 5. And always remember that definition, which is the broadest of all, that the just is giving to each, no matter what it is, what is its due. Until next time, see y'all later.